In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard lifted a hexagonal clay prism from the rubble of Nineveh. The tablet was one of 7 each. Copied scholars believe from originals that predate the library containing them by centuries. The cuneiform pressed into its surface described war, not allegory, not the symbolic conflict of seasonal gods that scholars so often reach for when ancient texts grow difficult. A war with weapons named a fleet described a general called Kinku commanding 11 subordinate helpers, and a victor Marduk who the moment the battle ended did something that the text records without commentary. He did not celebrate. He built walls, he set guards at the pool, he constructed in the precise language of the original Akkadian a roof over the deep to prevent the enemy from returning. That detail is small, and it refuses to go away. The text is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation. For most of the last 2 centuries it has been read as cosmogony, a poem explaining how the world came to be dressed in the language of divine conflict. Tiamat, the defeated enemy, becomes the primordial ocean. Marduk, the victor, becomes the organizing principle of the sky. Creation from destruction. A familiar shape found in ritual literature across dozens of cultures, but some researchers have read it differently, not as metaphor as record. They argue that if you remove the assumption that ancient peoples wrote only in symbol, certain passages begin to read less like poetry and more like something else entirely, a kind of technical memory, preserved not because it was beautiful, but because it described something that actually happened. And someone needed that description not to dissolve into silence. Tonight we follow 3 traces through that reading of the Babylonian creation record and through the central question it opens without resolving. If the Enuma Elish preserves not a myth of origins but something closer to a war log, then what was the third faction, the force the text describes as hunted, partially contained, and never entirely gone? And what might that question mean for everything? The record says happened afterward, we will not answer it. We will trace the outline of it slowly across 3 different kinds of evidence, what the ancient texts may have been encoding when they described gods who built underground and feared the sky. What certain features of the solar system, the asteroid belt, the outer reaches, the anomalies in the physical record of Mars might or might not suggest. And what humanity's own biology, specifically the recurring questions around gold, around blood type, and around the compression of our earliest recorded history, may be quietly holding beneath the surface. 3 traces, 1 question that stays open. Here is the detail that makes the first trace difficult to simply set aside. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk deploying what the text calls the 4 winds to contain Tiamat, and then releasing what it names the arrow, which in the Akkadian original tears through the interior structure and splits what the text describes as the heart. Many translators read this as metaphorical violence, the storm god tearing apart the chaos dragon. But several researchers have noted something quieter and harder to dismiss. The language used in that passage, sequential, precise, almost procedural, does not resemble the language used elsewhere in the same text to describe acts of divine will. It resembles instead the language of mechanism. That may mean nothing. Borrowed language borrows its texture from somewhere, but it is the kind of detail that once noticed does not entirely dissolve. And then there is this: the text states that after the destruction of the enemy, the bracelet of the solar system was shattered. Astronomers today refer to the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter as a region where planetary formation may have failed material that never coalesced into a single body. Within that debris field, scientists have detected micro-diamond structures that can form only under pressures comparable to nuclear detonation. Whether those 2 facts are related is something the record does not allow us to determine. But they sit adjacent to each other in a way that is difficult to simply file away. Some researchers argue the proximity is meaningful. That argument deserves weight. It does not prove anything, but it does not dissolve easily either. The mainstream reading of the Enuma Elish's ritual cosmogony is a serious scholarly position held by serious people across more than a century of Assyriology. The texts were composed for temple recitation. Their purpose was theological. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat almost certainly functioned within its original context as a narrative framework for explaining the cosmos and legitimizing Babylonian religious authority. That reading is not wrong to hold. What remains is a narrower question, not whether the texts are mythology, but whether mythology and memory were always as separate as we assume. Whether certain patterns repeated across cultures that never met in languages that share no common ancestor might be pointing at something the record has preserved without knowing what it was preserving. That is not proof, it is a pattern, and patterns, even unresolved ones, are worth tracing slowly. So we begin with the oldest layer, with the clay, the cuneiform, and the war the Babylonians recorded. At the beginning of everything, before the world was made, before the silence that followed was built. Now we follow the first trace not toward a conclusion, but toward the shape of the question itself. The library that was meant to last forever. The city of Nineveh, at its height in the 7th century BC, held approximately 30,000 clay tablets organized by subject cross, referenced by colophon, and stored in rooms whose shelves were labeled in the hand of trained scribes. This was not a casual accumulation, not the slow drift of documents that gathers in any administrative center over time. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who built the library to its full extent, sent scribes across the known world with explicit instructions: find the old texts, copy them, bring them back. He wanted everything: medical records, astronomical observations, hymns, ritual, calendars, and the old stories that predated Assyria, predated Babylon, predated even the cities of Sumer that had first pressed reed to wet clay in the 4th millennium BCE. He wanted the oldest layer of what his civilization knew gathered under one roof and kept. The library burned probably around 612 BCE, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked the city and brought the Assyrian Empire to its end. The fire by an accident of chemistry may have saved much of what it appeared to destroy. Clay does not burn the way wood burns, it bakes. The tablets that survived did so because the heat that consumed the shelves and the roof and everything perishable in the building hardened the clay into something approaching ceramic objects dense enough to wait underground for 25 centuries without losing a single wedge mark, a single line of the script pressed into them by hands that turned to dust before the Roman Republic existed. When Austin Henry Layard began excavating the mound at Kuyanjik in 1849, he was not finding artifacts so much as recovering a library that had been accidentally fired into permanence by the very catastrophe meant to erase it. Among the recovered tablets, copied in a hand that scholars estimate dates to the reign of Ashurbanipal himself, were the 7 tablets of the Enuma Elish, each one a chapter in a story that the colophons indicate was already considered ancient when Assyrian scribes transcribed it. The Enuma Elish, as a composed narrative, is generally dated by scholars to the late 2nd millennium BCE, somewhere in the range of 1200 to 1000 BCE, during the period when Marduk was elevated to the head of the Babylonian pantheon, and his victory over Tiamat served as theological justification for Babylon's political dominance over the region. This is the standard scholarly reading, and it is well supported by the textual evidence. A story that places your city's patron deity at the center of creation itself is the kind of story that gets commissioned by kings. Its theological utility is obvious, and it would be a mistake to ignore that utility when reading the text. But the Enuma Elish also contains elements that do not fit neatly into a narrative designed for theological convenience, and those elements are worth holding for a moment before moving past them. The text describes in specific technical language the pre-existing state of the cosmos, before Marduk's victory, a state involving multiple factions named commanders, a hierarchy of subordinate forces, and a conflict that is already in progress when the narrative opens. The gods aligned with Marduk are not confident. They are described as trembling, as hiding, as genuinely unable to formulate a response to what the text calls the weapons of terror deployed by Tiamat and her general Kingu. Some scholars read this as deliberate literary tension, the hero's victory made more satisfying by the magnitude of the threat he overcomes. That reading is reasonable. It requires the fewest additional assumptions. What it does not entirely account for is the procedural quality of the military language in certain passages. The Enuma Elish names Tiamat's forces not as a symbolic host gesturing at primordial chaos, but as 11 distinct subordinate helpers with differentiated roles. It describes the tablet of destiny as a physical object that Kingu carries, and that it functions in the text logic as a source of command authority over the opposing forces. When Marduk defeats Kingu, he does not destroy this object. He presses it to his own chest. He takes possession of it, That is the gesture of someone who understands a tool's function and wishes to control it rather than eliminate it, and it is a notably practical gesture for a text that is supposed to be operating entirely in the register of myth and symbol. Practical gestures in ancient literature are the details that most often turn out to have originated in something the composer remembered rather than invented. The question this raises is not whether the Enuma Elish is mythology. It clearly is, in the sense that it operates through divine personification and cosmological narrative. The narrower question is whether the mythology is encoding a memory the civilization could no longer fully articulate by the time it was written down. Whether there is beneath the theological scaffolding something older, a record of a conflict that was real. In some sense, the text can no longer name directly, and that left behind specific residue. A faction partially defeated but not erased, a defensive architecture built in the aftermath, a set of fears that structured everything the survivors did next. The Babylonians called the defeated enemy Tiamat. They described her forces as possessing technology, the weapons of terror, the tablet of destinies rather than simply supernatural power. They described the aftermath of her defeat not as peace but as construction. Marduk builds walls, sets guards, raises what the text calls a roof over the deep. He is not celebrating, he is fortifying. That distinction between a god who triumphs and rests and a god who triumphs and immediately begins building defences is the thread this episode will follow. 3 traces will carry us through the possibility that the Enuma Elish is preserving in however distorted a form a genuine memory of something that happened before recorded history, as we understand it began. The first trace runs through the physical record of the solar system itself. The second runs through the broader Mesopotamian textual tradition, the way gods are described behaving across multiple independent texts with a consistency that goes beyond the needs of any single theological program. The third runs through the human record of gold, its extraction, its movement, its hoarding, and the recurring strangeness of a civilization, wide compulsion, that no economic theory has ever fully explained. None of these traces will resolve the central question, but together they may allow the question to become visible in its full dimensions, which is for now enough. We begin where the physical evidence begins, not with a text, but with a gap in space between Mars and Jupiter that astronomers have been quietly arguing about for 300 years. The hammered bracelet, what the space between planets may be holding. Between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter at a distance from the Sun, ranging from roughly 2.2 to 3.2 astronomical units, there is a region of space that planetary scientists have been trying to account for since Johann Bode first noticed in 1772 that the mathematical sequence describing planetary distances seemed to predict a planet where none existed. The gap was too large, the gravitational arithmetic too suggestive of something missing. Early astronomers assumed they simply had not found it yet, that a planet occupied the region and was waiting to be named. What they found instead, beginning with the discovery of Ceres in 1801, was a belt of fragmented material, hundreds of thousands of objects ranging from dust to bodies nearly 1,000 kilometers across, distributed across a region of space wide enough to contain a world but containing by total mass less than 4% of the Moon. The belt was not a planet that had failed to form. The mass was insufficient. Something else had happened there or was happening still, and the debris field was the record of it. The standard model for the asteroid belt's origin holds that Jupiter's gravitational influence prevented the material in that region from ever coalescing into a planetary body during the solar system's formation approximately 4.5 billion years ago. The competing objects in the belt were repeatedly shattered before they could accumulate into anything larger, and what remains is essentially primordial, the unassembled raw material of a planet that never got to exist. This explanation is mathematically coherent and is supported by dynamical models of the early solar system. Most planetary scientists find it sufficient. The belt is not a mystery to them so much as an unresolved construction site frozen in place by competing gravitational forces. What complicates this reading without overturning it is the composition of certain objects within the belt. Among the recovered meteorites that originated in the asteroid belt, identified by their spectral signatures and orbital trajectories, a subset contains microdiamonds, crystalline carbon structures that can only form under pressures exceeding those found naturally anywhere in the inner solar system's formation history. The pressures required to produce micro-diamonds of the size and distribution found in certain carbonaceous chondrites are comparable by some analyses to those generated by high-energy impact events of extraordinary scale events that go beyond the gradual collision dynamics of planetary formation. The diamonds are not uniformly distributed across all belt material. They cluster in ways that some researchers argue suggest a localized high-energy event rather than a distributed formation process. The standard response is that large body collisions in the early solar system were common and energetic enough to account for the anomaly. That response is plausible. It does not entirely dissolve the clustering pattern. The Enuma Elish calls the region between the inner and outer planets the hammered bracelet. This is not a phrase that appears to have been chosen for poetic elegance alone. The Akemisa, Akkadian word used nufar in certain transliterations, carries a connotation of something worked by force shaped under impact rather than cast or grown. The text describes Marduk's victory over Tiamat, producing this bracelet as a byproduct of the conflict debris from the battle distributed across a specific region of space. Scholars who read the Enuma Elish as cosmological allegory interpret the hammered bracelet as a poetic description of the sky's dome, the firmament that separates the upper waters from the lower. That reading fits the theological context perfectly. What it does not account for is the spatial specificity the Enuma Elish places the bracelet between identifiable celestial bodies in a location that corresponds with uncomfortable precision to where the asteroid belt actually is. Whether that correspondence is meaningful or coincidental is something the record does not allow us to determine, but it is the kind of detail that sits in the mind long after the logical argument has moved on. The physical record of Mars adds a different layer to this trace. Mars today is a world with an average surface pressure roughly 1% of Earth's thin carbon dioxide atmosphere, insufficient to support liquid water at the surface, and a geological profile suggesting that whatever thicker atmosphere it may once have possessed was stripped away over geological time by solar wind erosion, aided by the planet's weak and largely absent magnetic field. This is the standard account, and it is supported by decades of orbital and surface observation. The timeline for Mars's atmospheric loss is generally placed at roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, deep in the planet's early history, before complex life emerged on Earth. By that reading, Mars was never a candidate for civilization. It was always a dead end. In 2014, a physicist named John Brandenburg published an analysis of atmospheric isotope data from the Viking and Curiosity missions, arguing that the concentrations of xenon-129 and certain uranium and thorium isotopes in the Martian surface and atmosphere were inconsistent with gradual atmospheric loss and more consistent with the large-scale nuclear detonation events. Xenon-129 is produced in significant concentrations by nuclear fission. It is a reliable isotope signature of explosive nuclear events found on Earth in elevated concentrations at nuclear test sites. Brandenburg's analysis suggested that Mars had experienced at some point in its history at least one, possibly two planetary-scale nuclear events energetic enough to strip the atmosphere and sterilize the surface. The scientific community received this analysis with considerable skepticism, and the criticism was substantive. Brandenburg's interpretation required assumptions about pre-existing Martian civilization that the data alone could not support. And his isotope ratios, several researchers argued, were within the range. Explainable by natural processes, including supervolcanism and large meteorite impacts, the paper was not widely accepted. What Brandenburg's analysis did, whatever its ultimate validity, was direct attention to patterns in the Martian data that the standard model had not been asked to explain with particular urgency. The specific distribution of xenon-129 across the northern hemisphere of Mars, concentrated in ways that cluster rather than disperse evenly as a global volcanic or impact origin might predict. Not proof of anything. A distributional pattern that some researchers argue deserves more careful attention than it has received. The Enuma Elish describes the conflict that produced the hammered bracelet as having a prior phase and earlier engagement on a different battlefield before the forces involved reached the inner solar system. Whether Mars is a record of that prior phase, or simply a planet that lost its atmosphere to solar wind over 4 billion years, is a question the physical evidence alone cannot settle. And it is precisely at that unsettled boundary between the geological and the mythological, between the natural and the deliberate, that the second trace begins to take shape. Gods who tremble. What the textual record says about fear. The Atrahasis. Epic predates the Enuma Elish by several centuries in its oldest recovered form, and it tells a different kind of story, quieter, more domestic, more concerned with labour than with war. A British Museum tablet catalogued as BSEM 78941 copied during the Old Babylonian period roughly 1700 BCE preserves the most complete version we currently possess, though fragments of the narrative appear across dozens of other tablets recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, suggesting that the story was widely copied, widely known, and considered important enough to preserve in multiple independent textual lineages. Its central concern is not the origin of the cosmos, but the origin of humanity, specifically why human beings were created and what function they were designed to serve. That question and the answer the Atrahasis provides is the second trace this episode needs to follow. The Atrahasis opens not with chaos and void, but with a labour crisis. The younger gods, called the Agigi, have been assigned the task of digging canals, mining ore, and maintaining the physical infrastructure of the divine world for an unspecified but very long period described in the text as lasting 3,600 years. The opening of the narrative, they have reached the limit of what they will endure. They burn their tools. They surround the house of Enlil, the chief god, at night, and when he asks who is responsible for the disturbance, the answer given by their leader is one of the most direct statements in ancient literature. Every single one of us has declared war. The toil is excessive. It is killing us. The rebellion is not a theological abstraction. It is a labour struggle, conducted by beings who possess advanced capabilities. The text elsewhere describes the Agigi as managing celestial stations operating across vast distances, performing tasks that require coordination and technical knowledge, and who have nonetheless been assigned physical labour for millennia and have finally refused. The resolution proposed by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, is the creation of a substitute worker. The text uses the Akkadian term Lulu, meaning the primitive or the mixed one, and describes the creation process in language that sounds to a modern ear less like divine breath and more like directed biology. Clay is mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god, a being is formed, and the being is given the Elu, a term scholars translate variously as spirit divine essence, or cognitive capacity sufficient to perform the task the Agigi have abandoned. The new creature bears the yoke, the Agigi are released. The infrastructure continues to function. What the Atrahasis describes is not a creation motivated by love or loneliness or the desire for companionship. It is a creation motivated by operational necessity, by the need to maintain a system whose existing workforce had reached the point of collapse. This reading is not fringe. It is the reading that a straightforward engagement with the text produces when theological assumptions are set aside. Thorkild Jacobson, one of the 20th century's most careful Sumerologists, described the Atrahasis as a narrative primarily concerned with the further problem of divine labour and its solution through human substitution. The theological interpretation that humanity was created to worship the gods to serve them in a spiritual rather than a practical sense was a later overlay, Jacobson argued. A reframing that made the story more palatable to populations who preferred to believe their existence had a sacred rather than a utilitarian origin. The text itself does not support the sacred reading with anything like the same clarity it supports the utilitarian one. What the Atrahasis adds to the pattern established in the Enuma Elish is a behavioural signature that appears once noticed across an unexpectedly wide range of Mesopotamian divine narratives. The gods in these texts are not omnipotent. They are not serene. They are beings who get tired, who make mistakes, who argue with each other, who experience fear with a specificity that goes beyond literary convention. In the Atrahasis itself, when the flood that Enlil eventually authorises to reduce the human population actually arrives, the gods do not watch from a position of comfortable authority. The text says they crouched like dogs against the outer wall. The mother goddess Ninhursag weeps. Anu, the highest of the gods, is described as paralysed. These are not the emotional responses of beings who caused a catastrophe on purpose and are satisfied with the result. They are the responses of beings who authorised a catastrophic measure under extreme pressure and are genuinely uncertain whether it will achieve what they needed it to achieve. The behavioural pattern holds across the Gilgamesh epic, The Descent of Inanna, and several of the shorter Sumerian mythological texts. In each of them, the gods are reactive rather than omniscient, constrained rather than unlimited, operating within systems they did not entirely design and cannot entirely control. When Gilgamesh reaches the waters of death and demands to know the secret of immortality, the divine keeper of those waters does not refuse him from a position of effortless superiority. She deflects, redirects, and ultimately sends him on a quest whose failure is built into its design. The gods in these texts manage outcomes rather than determining them. They are administrators of a system under pressure, not architects of a universe they govern at leisure. That distinction between administration and creation, between management and omnipotence, is the detail in the textual record that no theological reading has ever satisfactorily explained. Some researchers have argued that this behavioural signature is itself a form of encoded memory, that the gods described in Mesopotamian literature behave like beings who are hiding something, managing something, afraid of something, beyond the edges of the narrative, because the tradition that produced these texts was preserving a genuine recollection of beings who were doing exactly those things. That argument cannot be proven from the texts alone, but the consistency of the pattern across centuries of independent composition, across texts produced by different scribal schools for different political purposes, is the kind of convergence that tends to mean something even when what it means remains genuinely unclear. And it is that convergence, the trembling gods, the reactive decisions, the fear that appears in text after text without a named source that the third trace will now attempt to complicate rather than confirm. The weight of gold. A compulsion without a satisfying explanation. Pull a gold bar from any central bank vault and weigh it in your hands approximately 12 kilograms, the standard London used good delivery size, and what you are holding is an object that no civilization has ever been able to explain its obsession with to the satisfaction of anyone who asks the question carefully enough. Gold is soft, it scratches with a fingernail under sufficient pressure, it cannot hold an edge. It conducts electricity well, but not exceptionally. Copper does it almost as well, and is orders of magnitude more abundant. It is too heavy to wear in quantity too rare to use structurally and too inert to serve most of the chemical purposes that make other metals industrially indispensable. By every practical measure, gold is a deeply inconvenient material around which to organize a civilization's deepest values. And yet every civilization without exception in every region of the world where human beings have left a material record has done exactly that. The compulsion is so universal, so consistent across cultures that never contacted each other, that treating it as a purely cultural phenomenon, as something that spread from one origin point and was adopted by others, no longer fully accounts for its distribution. Something else may be operating in the background. The Mesopotamian textual tradition is among ancient sources the most explicit about why gold was important to the divine hierarchy. The Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis both describe the gods' relationship to gold in terms that go beyond ornament or status. The Sumerian term Gushkin gold appears in the divine administrative texts, not in lists of luxury goods, but in lists of materials required for specific technical functions, functions that the texts describe in language consistent with maintenance and infrastructure rather than decoration. The Anunnaki in multiple textual sources are described as requiring gold for the upkeep of their mere term, scholars translate as divine laws, or cosmic functions, the underlying mechanisms by which the world operates in its ordered state. When the me are threatened or degraded, the texts describe crisis. When they are maintained, stability continues. Gold is listed among the materials by which the me are sustained. That is a specific functional claim, not a poetic one, and it appears too consistently across too many independent textual sources to be dismissed as incidental metaphor. What makes this trace the most genuinely destabilizing of the three is not what the ancient texts say about gold. It is what the modern record does with it, that the ancient text did not predict and cannot explain away. Consider the distribution of gold extraction across human history. The oldest known gold mining operations at Sakdrisi in Georgia date to approximately 3000 BCE, emerging with uncomfortable timing in the same general era as the first Mesopotamian city-states. gold mining in the Nubian desert, in the Witwatersrand basin of South Africa, in the river systems of Mesoamerica, all begin within what is in geological terms a single compressed moment of human development. The compulsion to extract gold appears to have activated across widely separated populations at roughly the same point in history as if a threshold had been crossed or a signal received. This may be coincidence. Human populations were developing metallurgy broadly in this period, and gold's physical properties, its presence in alluvial deposits, its resistance to tarnish its visual distinctiveness, make it among the easiest metals to identify and collect without advanced technology. The timing may simply reflect the general development of metallurgical awareness rather than anything more directed. But here is where the trace actively complicates rather than confirms if gold's value is culturally constructed, if its importance was established by early human civilizations as a proxy for status and exchange. Then the archaeological record should show a period before gold was important, a stratum in which human societies organized value around other materials and had not yet elevated gold to its eventual position. That stratum is remarkably difficult to find. The sites that predate the cities-states that predate writing, that predate the organizational complexity we associate with civilization, already show evidence of gold collection and special treatment. At Varna, on the Black Sea coast of modern Bulgaria, a burial site dated to approximately 4500 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the earliest Mesopotamian writing, contains the oldest known collection of worked gold objects in the world. The graves at Varna are not uniform. Some contain extraordinary quantities of gold, others contain none at all. The differential is so pronounced and the workmanship of the gold objects so refined for the period that archaeologists have concluded the site represents a fully developed social hierarchy in which gold already functions as the primary marker of status and possibly of sacred authority. The culture that produced Varna left no written record. We do not know what they believed about gold or why they valued it. We know only that they did intensely before any of the textual traditions that explain gold's importance had yet been composed. The modern behaviour around gold adds a final layer that the ancient texts strangely seem to anticipate. Central banks do not use the gold they hold, they store it. The gold in the vaults beneath the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, approximately 6,000 tons, as of the most recent public accounting, has not moved in any economically meaningful sense for decades. It sits in sealed rooms, transferred occasionally from one nation's compartment to another's, but never consumed, never fabricated, never put to work in the way that a stored resource in a functional economy would be. It is maintained. The global economy has, since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, operated without gold as an active monetary mechanism. Gold no longer backs currency. It no longer settles international accounts in any formal sense. By every principle of rational economics, the vast institutional stockpiles of gold that governments continue to hold and continue to guard should have been liquidated and redeployed into productive assets decades ago. They have not been. The question of why they have not been is one that economists answer with theories of psychological anchoring and historical inertia explanations that are coherent as far as they go, but that do not quite account for the intensity with which institutions resist any proposal to treat gold as simply another commodity. What the gold trace opens, and what it refuses to close, is the possibility that the compulsion to extract, refine, and preserve this specific metal is not a cultural artifact, but something older and less voluntary. And it is that possibility the convergence chapter will now be forced to hold alongside the two traces that preceded it. 3 lines toward the same horizon. What does it mean when 3 independent lines of evidence drawn from 3 different disciplines point in the same direction, without any of them having been designed to do so? The asteroid belt data and the Martian isotope record belong to planetary science, a field that has no institutional interest in ancient Mesopotamian literature, and no methodological tradition of consulting it. The behavioural signature of fear and administrative anxiety embedded in the Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh cycle belongs to Assyriology and comparative mythology fields that have no particular reason to concern themselves with the distributional patterns of Xenon 129 on the Martian surface. The gold compulsion belongs simultaneously to economics, archaeology, and anthropology, 3 disciplines that rarely speak to each other with precision, and that have each independently failed to produce a fully satisfying account of why gold does what it does across human history. These 3 lines were not drawn by anyone trying to make them meet. They were drawn by researchers working in isolation from each other, on different materials using different methods, asking different questions. And yet when you place them side by side and step back far enough to see all 3 at once, they appear to be describing edges of the same shape. The shape, if it is a shape, goes something like this. At some point before recorded history, before the Sumerian city-states, before the first cuneiform tablets, before anything we would recognize as civilization, something occurred in this region of the solar system that left residue across multiple registers simultaneously: physical, textual, and behavioral. The physical residue is the asteroid belt and the Martian surface record anomalies that the standard models account for adequately, but not completely, leaving distributional patterns and compositional details that some researchers argue deserve explanations with more energy behind them than gradual formation dynamics or solar wind erosion can provide. The textual residue is the Mesopotamian divine literature, a body of writing that describes with remarkable consistency across centuries of independent composition beings who behave like beings, managing the aftermath of a catastrophe rather than administering a universe they control. The behavioral residue is gold, a metal that human civilizations across every continent began collecting, refining and treating as sacred at roughly the same compressed moment in history, and that they have never stopped hoarding in quantities far beyond any functional economic need. 3 residues, 1 implied event. The convergence does not prove the event occurred. It suggests that whatever the event was, or whatever the tradition that produced these 3 residues was responding to it, was large enough to leave marks in the physical record of the solar system, in the psychological texture of our oldest literature, and in the economic behavior of every human civilization that has left a material trace. That is a wide footprint for something that conventional history does not acknowledge as having happened at all. The Enuma Elish read against this convergence begins to function differently than it does when read in isolation. The defensive architecture Marduk builds after his victory, the walls, the guards, the roof over the deep, is not the behaviour of a god who has eliminated a threat. It is the behaviour of a commander who has neutralised a threat temporarily and knows it may return. The text says the guards are set specifically to watch for the return of the chaotic force, not to commemorate the victory, not to mark the boundary of the new order for symbolic purposes, to watch. The distinction is significant because it implies ongoing threat, not concluded war, and ongoing threat implies that whatever the third faction was, whatever Tiamat represented in the tradition that produced the Enuma Elish, it was not considered gone, it was considered distant, contained, possibly delayed. The defensive posture the text describes is the posture of a civilization living in the aftermath of an engagement it is not certain will not resume. Place that posture next to the behavioral signature in the Atrahasis, the gods who crouched like dogs, who wept, who made the catastrophic decision to flood the surface of the earth, not from confidence but from panic, and a consistent psychological profile begins to emerge across 2 independent textual traditions. The beings described in Mesopotamian literature are not behaving like conquerors. They are behaving like survivors who have made it to a temporary position of safety and are doing everything in their power to maintain that safety without drawing attention to themselves. The flood in the Atrahasis is not a punishment for human wickedness in any theologically coherent sense. The text does not develop the moral case for it with anything like the urgency it would need to justify the scale of the act. The flood is a silencing. Enlil's stated reason for wanting humanity reduced is the noise, a word that in the original Akkadian Rigmu carries connotations of tumult, signal, broadcast, the kind of energetic disturbance that travels. He wants the signal reduced. He wants the surface quieter. That is not the language of moral judgment. It is the language of operational security. And then there is the gold. If the beings described in these texts were managing a planetary situation rather than governing a universe, if they were in some sense the tradition could no longer fully articulate maintaining infrastructure and managing exposure to a threat they could not eliminate, then gold's repeated appearance in the functional lists in the maintenance language of the divine administrative texts begins to suggest a purpose the standard readings do not reach. Gold is listed among the materials that sustain the me, the underlying operating mechanisms of the divine order. Gold is extracted from the earth at scale by a labour force specifically created for that purpose. Gold is accumulated, refined, and then by the modern record stored without being used. The chain from the Atrahasis to the vaults beneath Manhattan is long and involves many transformations, but the terminal behaviour extraction, refinement, storage, maintenance has not changed in its essential character across 5,000 years of recorded human activity. Something in that chain has remained continuous even as everything around it transformed. Not proof, a pattern, and the pattern held at sufficient distance has a coherence that is harder to dismiss than any of its individual components. Before that coherence can be accepted as meaningful, however, it needs to be tested against the strongest arguments available against it. And those arguments, when they are presented fairly, turn out to carry genuine weight of their own. What the careful objection reveals. A serious scholar of ancient Near Eastern religion, presented with the three traces assembled in the previous chapter, would not be dismissive. She would be precise. She would say, and she would be right to say, that the convergence described between the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, and the physical anomalies of the solar system depends on a series of interpretive moves that each individually require the reader to prefer the less parsimonious explanation. Parsimony is not a trivial standard. In the history of inquiry, the habit of preferring the explanation that requires the fewest new assumptions has been, more often than not, the habit that leads toward, rather than away from, accurate understanding. The scholar would be right to invoke it here, and the right response to that invocation is not to argue against parsimony as a principle, but to follow it carefully into each of the three domains and see precisely what it does and does not account for. Begin with the Enuma Elish. The mainstream scholarly position that the text is a theological composition produced in the 12th or 11th century BCE to legitimize Marduk's elevation. As the head of the Babylonian pantheon is not a conjecture. It is supported by the text's internal structure, by the political history of the period, by comparison with similar legitimizing narratives from neighboring cultures, and by a century of careful philological work. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is cosmological allegory, the storm god defeating the primordial ocean order arising from chaos, the world built from the body of the defeated enemy. This is a mythological structure so widely distributed across human cultures, from the Vedic Indra defeating Vritra to the Norse Thor against the Midgard serpent, that it clearly reflects something deep in how human beings' narrative eyes the relationship between order and disorder, not something specific about an actual historical conflict. The procedural military language that the previous chapter found significant, the named commanders, the tablet of destinies, the weapons of terror, is by this reading simply the texture of Babylonian literary convention, which drew heavily on the language of royal military campaigns to describe divine action. Kings destroyed their enemies with weapons named in inscriptions. Gods destroy their enemies with weapons named in epics. The register is consistent. The inference that military language implies military memory is not warranted. What this objection handles well is the Enuma Elish's compositional context. What it handles less well is the consistency of the behavioural pattern across texts that were not composed for the same purpose or by the same institutional tradition. The Atrahasis was not composed to legitimize Marduk. It predates Marduk's elevation by centuries in its oldest recovered layers, and its theological program, insofar as it has, one is concerned with the relationship between human labour and divine need, not with cosmological sovereignty. The gods in the Atrahasis are frightened for reasons the text does not explain by reference to any named enemy. They crouch against walls. They weep at the consequence of decisions they themselves authorized. This is not the emotional register of beings performing cosmological allegory for a political audience. It is the emotional register of beings responding to an operational situation that has exceeded their control. The mainstream reading of the Atrahasis acknowledges the god's distress, but frames it as literary humanization, an ancient storytelling technique that makes divine characters sympathetic by giving them recognizably human emotional responses. That framing is internally consistent. It does not, however, explain why the same emotional profile, reactive, frightened, operationally constrained, appears with the same texture across a dozen independent Mesopotamian compositions spanning more than 1,000 years of literary production. Turn now to the planetary science. The asteroid belt's origin in Jupiter's gravitational disruption of planetary formation is among the three skeptic arguments available here the most technically robust. The dynamical models that describe how Jupiter's gravity scattered and dispersed the material in the belt are detailed, mathematically sophisticated, and consistent with the observed distribution of belt objects across multiple spectral and compositional categories. The microdiamonds present in certain carbonaceous chondrites are by the majority scientific view explicable by large body impact events that were common in the early solar system events, energetic enough to produce the localized pressure spikes required for diamond formation, without invoking anything beyond natural impact dynamics. John Brandenburg's Xenon 129 analysis for Mars was reviewed critically by multiple planetary scientists, and the consensus response was that his isotope ratios fell within ranges accountable by natural processes, including volcanic outgassing and meteorite impacts, without requiring the extraordinary hypothesis of planetary-scale nuclear detonation. These are substantive criticisms made by people with the technical background to evaluate the data. Brandenburg's interpretation remains outside the scientific mainstream, not because of institutional conservatism, but because the evidence he presented did not meet the evidentiary standard required to support a claim of that magnitude. What the planetary science objection does not resolve is the question of why the Enuma Elish describes the region between the inner and outer planets with spatial specificity that exceeds what cosmological allegory requires. Allegory does not need accurate geography. A mythological account of creation through divine conflict has no functional need to place the debris of that conflict in the correct orbital zone between the correct planets, and yet it does. Whether that accuracy is the result of ancient astronomical observation, Mesopotamian astronomers were by the 7th century BCE among the most precise naked-eye observers in the ancient world, or something older and less easily categorized. The text's spatial precision is a detail that the standard allegorical reading absorbs without fully digesting. The gold objection is the most straightforward of the three, and in some respects the most genuinely satisfying. Gold's universal cultural value is explicable by a combination of physical properties, its visual distinctiveness, its resistance to corrosion, its workability without advanced metallurgy, its presence in alluvial deposits accessible to pre-industrial extraction that would reliably cause independently developing cultures to assign it special status. The Varna burial site's extraordinary gold concentration, rather than suggesting a pre-existing compulsion, may simply reflect that. By 4500 BCE in the Black Sea region, agricultural surplus had created sufficient social complexity to generate hierarchy, and gold was the most visually obvious available material with which to mark it. The institutional gold hoarding of modern central banks is explicable by historical inertia and the psychological anchoring of centuries of monetary convention. These explanations are adequate. They are not quite complete. The pattern that remains after the objections have been heard is narrower than the one that existed before them, but it has not been eliminated. The convergence across disciplines still holds its shape. The behavioral signature of Mesopotamian divine literature still lacks a fully satisfying explanation within the framework of theological allegory alone. And the question the Enuma Elish opens, what was the third faction, and what did its partial containment require of the beings who survived the encounters with it, remains, after the most careful objections available, genuinely unresolved. The unresolved remainder is where the next trace begins, not from the texts or the planetary record, but from the structure of the defensive system the texts describe being built. The architecture of aftermath. What gets built when the war is over? There is a particular quality of attention that settles in after a serious objection has been heard and absorbed, not the attention of someone who has been convinced, but the attention of someone who has been made more careful. The three skeptic arguments presented in the previous chapter were not weak ones. The compositional context of the Enuma Elish is real. The dynamical models for the asteroid belt are mathematically robust. The cultural explanations for gold's universal value are internally coherent. Absorbing those arguments honestly does not require abandoning the pattern they were directed against. It requires holding the pattern more precisely, stripping away the parts that the objections genuinely dissolve, and attending more carefully to what remains when they are finished. What remains after that process is not a theory. It is a structural question, And the structural question is this: if a civilization survived a catastrophic conflict with a technologically superior adversary, and if that civilization needed to maintain a position of concealment in the aftermath, what would the physical and textual record of that concealment look like? Not what would it prove, what would it look like? The answer to that question turns out to have a specific shape, and the shape fits the record with an accuracy that the objections addressed in the previous chapter did not reach. Begin with the outer solar system, because that is where the Enuma Elish's defensive language points when it is read with the spatial attention it rewards. The text describes Marduk after his victory constructing a station, a watching post at the boundary of the known region, specifically tasked with detecting the return of the defeated force. Modern astronomy has identified two structures at the outer boundary of the solar system that have no fully satisfying natural explanation in their current form. The first is the Kuiper Belt, a flattened disk of icy objects extending from roughly 30 to 50 astronomical units from the Sun, whose orbital resonances are by the most recent dynamical analyses consistent with influence from a massive undiscovered body. This hypothetical body, designated Planet 9 by the Caltech team that proposed its existence in 2016, has not been directly observed. Its presence is inferred from the clustered orbital inclinations of a subset of trans-Neptunian objects that behave as though they are being shepherded rather than simply drifting. The shepherding hypothesis is taken seriously by mainstream planetary science. What mainstream planetary science does not address is the possibility that the shepherding body is not a planet at all, but something placed a dense object in a specific orbital position for a specific purpose. That possibility requires assumptions the data alone cannot support. But the Enuma Elish's description of a watching station placed at the boundary of the controlled region in a specific location designed to detect approach from outside describes exactly the orbital function that Planet 9's inferred gravitational signature appears to be performing. The second outer solar system structure is the Oort cloud, a vast spherical shell of icy debris extending from roughly 2,000 to 100,000 astronomical units from the Sun, so distant that no object within it has ever been directly observed. Its existence is inferred from the trajectories of long-period comets that arrive in the inner solar system from all directions, suggesting a spherical source rather than a planar one. The Standard Model describes the Oort cloud as a repository of primordial material ejected from the inner solar system during the early period of planetary formation, scattered outward by gravitational interactions with the giant planets and left in loosely bound orbits at the solar system's edge. This model is coherent. It is also, as several astronomers have noted, geometrically unusual. Naturally formed debris structures in rotating systems tend toward disk configurations, rings. Rings, belts, flattened planes because rotation preferentially distributes material in a plane rather than a sphere. The spherical geometry of the Oort cloud is within the framework of natural formation, an anomaly that the Standard Model explains by invoking stellar perturbations and galactic tidal forces over billions of years. Those mechanisms are real. Whether they are sufficient to produce a structure as geometrically regular as the Oort cloud's inferred spherical distribution is a question that planetary scientists acknowledge as not fully settled. What the Enuma Elish describes Marduk building after his victory is a roof. The Akkadian term is supuk shem, meaning literally the load-bearing structure of the sky, the thing that holds the boundary between the controlled interior and the uncontrolled exterior. It's placed in the text's spatial logic at the outermost limit of the region Marduk now administers. A spherical shell of material at the outermost limit of the solar system, positioned to scatter incoming observation and diffuse the thermal signature of everything it encloses, would function precisely as a roof in the engineering sense. The text describes not a cosmological metaphor, but a physical barrier whose purpose is containment and concealment. Whether the Oort cloud is that structure, or whether it is simply the natural residue of planetary formation that the Standard Model describes, cannot be determined from the available evidence. The morphological correspondence between the text description and the structure's observed geometry is, however, precise enough to be held as a genuine data point, rather than dismissed as coincidence. The recovery after skeptic does not mean the return of certainty. It means the identification of what the objections left untouched. And in this case, what they left untouched is the structural correspondence between the defensive architecture described in the Enuma Elish and the actual physical structures found at the outer boundary of the solar system. that no version of the theological allegory reading has yet been asked to explain. Allegory does not build accurate outer solar system geometry. Astronomical observation might, but the Babylonian astronomers of the first millennium BCE did not possess instruments capable of detecting trans-Neptunian objects. Something produced the correspondence. What that something was remains after the skeptic chapter, and after this one genuinely open. The next trace does not stay at the solar system's edge. It returns to the surface of the Earth, to a physical material that appears in the wrong places in the wrong quantities, and for reasons that the standard account of ancient construction has never fully explained. Mercury stone and the logic of what gets hidden. In 2015, the Mexican archaeologist Sergio Gomez Chavez announced the discovery of liquid mercury pooled in a chamber at the end of a tunnel running beneath the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan, a pre-Columbian city whose builders remain unidentified, whose language has never been deciphered, and whose population at its height of roughly 450 CE may have reached 125,000 people, making it among the largest cities in the world at the time. The mercury itself had been known about in fragmentary form for several years before the formal announcement detected by instruments, before it was visually confirmed. Several litres of the liquid metal sealed in the chamber's interior, positioned in a spatial arrangement that Gomez Chavez described as possibly representing the underworld rivers of Mesoamerican cosmology. The cosmological interpretation may be correct. What the cosmological interpretation does not address is the material fact of the mercury itself, where it came from, how it was transported, and what function beyond symbolic representation several litres of a toxic, volatile, and technically complex refined metal was serving in a sealed underground chamber beneath a pyramid whose builders left no written explanation of anything they constructed. Mercury does not occur naturally in liquid form at the surface in concentrations of several litres. It must be refined from cinnabar mercuric sulfide through a roasting process that requires controlled high-temperature furnaces and considerable technical knowledge to execute without producing lethal quantities of mercury vapour. The nearest known cinnabar deposits to Teotihuacan are located in the state of Querétaro, approximately 200 kilometers from the site. The transportation of refined liquid mercury across that distance in sufficient quantity to fill the chamber arrangement described by Gomez Chavez would have required sealed containers of a sophistication not typically associated with the material culture, otherwise recovered at the site. The mercury was not, in other words, a casual inclusion. It was a deliberate, technically demanding and logistically complex deposit placed in a specific location underground for a reason the site's builders did not record in any surviving form. The Teotihuacan mercury is the sharpest example of a pattern that appears at lower resolution across a range of ancient construction sites whose builders paid particular, and sometimes extraordinary attention to what they placed beneath structures rather than inside or on top of them. The Great Pyramid at Giza was found in the 18th century to contain traces of what early investigators described as a fine reddish powder in the king's chamber sarcophagus, a detail so anomalous that it was largely set aside by subsequent Egyptology and has not been systematically re-examined with modern analytical tools. The foundation deposits beneath Mesopotamian temples. Small boxes containing gold, silver, and specific mineral combinations sealed under cornerstones at the moment of construction are well documented and were clearly ritual in function. But the specific materials chosen for these deposits follow patterns of selection that the standard ritual interpretation has not fully mapped. Certain minerals appear repeatedly across sites, separated by centuries and hundreds of kilometers, suggesting a coherent technical tradition rather than purely local religious convention. The Abzu in Sumerian cosmology was not simply the underworld in the conventional religious sense. It was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, water and craft, and its physical location in the text is described with a specificity that goes beyond metaphor. It is beneath the surface. It contains fresh water that rises from below. It is the source of the me, the divine functions, the operational mechanisms of the ordered world. And it is critically the place where Enki does his work, where he designs, where he builds, where he keeps the things that must not be on the surface. The Sumerian word for the deep underground space that Enki inhabits, Abzu, shares its root with the Akkadian Apsu, which appears in the Enuma Elish as the name of the primordial fresh water from which creation emerged. The lexical connection between the underground workshop and the primordial creative medium is not incidental. It suggests that in the Mesopotamian conceptual framework, the underground was not the place where things were buried. It was the place where things were made maintained and kept safe. This distinction between burial and maintenance is the one that the physical evidence from Teotihuacan, from the Mesopotamian Foundation deposits, and from the range of anomalous underground inclusions at ancient sites keeps raising without being able to settle. The mercury beneath the pyramid of the feathered serpent is not in a burial context. There are no human remains in the chamber where it was found. There is no funerary equipment, no offering array of the type associated with interment. What there is in Gomez Chavez's description of the chamber is spatial organization, the mercury arranged in a deliberate pattern in a sealed space at the end of a tunnel that had been specifically constructed and then deliberately blocked. Something was being maintained in that chamber, or something was being kept in a condition of preservation, or something was being shielded from the surface environment by the mass of stone above it. The cosmological interpretation says it represents the underworld. That interpretation and the maintenance interpretation are not mutually exclusive. The most important things in a civilization are often simultaneously sacred and functional. The expansion this chapter undertakes is not toward a conclusion about what these underground deposits were for. It is toward a recognition that the pattern of deliberate underground placement, specific materials, specific locations, specific geometries of concealment appears across cultures and centuries with a consistency that the standard framework of independent religious development does not fully explain. Teotihuacan and Mesopotamia did not share a trade network. They did not share a language family. The probability that they independently developed the same specific practice of sealing technically complex materials in subterranean chambers beneath their most architecturally ambitious structures is not zero, but it is low enough to deserve sustained attention. What that sustained attention eventually produces is when the underground deposits are placed alongside the outer solar system structures, and the textual behavioral signature assembled in earlier chapters is a picture of concealment operating at multiple scales simultaneously, and it is that multi-scale picture that the next chapter will hold without explanation. The scale at which coincidence becomes a different kind of problem. 4,534 nautical miles. That is the distance measured along the surface of the Earth between the Great Pyramid at Giza and the pyramid complex at Teotihuacan. The figure itself is not remarkable. What is remarkable is what it represents as a fraction of the Earth's total polar circumference, exactly 1/3, not approximately 1/3, not close enough to 1/3 that a generous reading might round it there. 1/3 to a precision that exceeds the margin of error in modern geodetic measurement, and far exceeds the precision that the surveying tools available to either civilization's builders should have been capable of producing independently. The two sites do not share a trade network and a language family, a material culture, or a historical contact point supported by any evidence in the archaeological record. They were built by people who by every conventional account had no knowledge of each other's existence, and yet they are placed on the surface of the Earth in a spatial relationship that encodes to extraordinary precision a specific fraction of the planet's total circumference, a fraction that could only be calculated by someone who already knew what the total circumference was. This is not a new observation. It has been made in various forms by researchers working in archaeo, astronomy, and ancient metrology for several decades. The mainstream response has been consistent. The correspondence is the result of confirmation bias, the human tendency to find meaningful patterns in large data sets by selectively attending to the hits and ignoring the misses. There are thousands of ancient sites distributed across the Earth's surface. Any sufficiently large set of points on a sphere will contain subsets with interesting geometric relationships. The observation proves nothing. That response is methodologically sound. What it does not address is why the specific sites that produce these correspondences are consistently the most architecturally ambitious, the most precisely constructed, and the most technically anomalous structures in their respective regions. The pattern is not drawn from random points. It is drawn from the sites that already require explanation on independent ground sites whose construction demands, in terms of mass-moving capacity and geometric precision capabilities that the civilizations credited with building them, are not otherwise known to have possessed. Baalbek, in what is now Lebanon, contains 3 stone blocks in its foundation platform, the so-called trilithon, each weighing approximately 800 tons, placed with sub-centimetre precision against each other, and against the courses above them. A fourth block still partially attached to the quarry floor, approximately a kilometre from the site, weighs an estimated 1,650 tons, making it the largest worked stone object in the ancient world. The conventional dating places the Troilus Lithan's construction in the Roman period approximately the 1st century BCE, when Roman engineers were building the Temple of Jupiter above the existing platform. Roman engineering was sophisticated by any measure. Roman engineers moved large stones regularly. The largest stones reliably attributed to Roman construction elsewhere in the ancient world weigh approximately 60 tons. The trilithan blocks are more than 13 times heavier. No Roman text describes how they were moved. No engineering analysis has produced a satisfying account of how the available technology of the period human labour, wooden rollers, ropes of organic fibre, could have positioned objects of that mass with the precision the blocks display. The standard response is that Roman engineers were capable of more than surviving text record. That response may be correct. It is not a demonstration. It is an assertion made in the absence of evidence, which is a different thing. The acoustic properties of certain ancient enclosed spaces add a layer to this chapter's pattern that belongs to a different sensory register entirely. The king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid resonates when measured with modern acoustic instruments at a fundamental frequency of approximately 438 Hz, a value so close to concert A that a tuned instrument played inside the chamber would naturally sustain in resonance with the room's architecture. The chamber's granite walls and ceiling were quarried from Aswan approximately 800 kilometers south and transported to the plateau in blocks averaging 70 tons each. The choice of Aswan granite over the locally available limestone was not structurally necessary. Limestone would have supported the chamber's load. Granite was chosen for a reason the builders did not resort, and granite is among common construction materials exceptional in one specific property. It is piezoelectric. Compressed granite generates an electrical charge. The king's chamber is built from a material that, under the pressure of the pyramid's mass above it, produces a continuous low-level electrical field. Whether that field served a function, or whether the acoustic resonance of the chamber was deliberately engineered rather than incidentally achieved, are questions the architectural record raises without answering. Placed against the pattern assembled across the previous 8 chapters, the Enuma Elish's defensive architecture, the Atrahasis' operational gods, the gold compulsion, the outer solar system's anomalous structures, the underground deposits at Teotihuacan and across Mesopotamia, the physical evidence from Baalbek from the Giza, Teotihuacan geodetic relationship, and from the acoustic and electrical properties of ancient enclosed spaces produces a picture whose individual elements each have conventional explanations and whose totality resists them. The conventional explanations are not wrong. They are simply insufficient, not in the sense that they fail to account for each anomaly individually, but in the sense that they cannot account for the anomalies appearing together repeatedly across cultures and continents that share no known contact in structures whose technical demands cluster consistently above what their builders' otherwise attested capabilities should have permitted. This is the highest point the pattern reaches, not proof of anything, not evidence of a specific claim. A structural convergence across a physical, textual and geodetic registers that points without resolving toward a level of technical coordination in the deep human past that the standard historical model has not yet found a way to absorb. The detail is small and it refuses to go away, and in this case it is not one detail but dozens distributed across the entire surface of the planet and the full span of a recorded time, all pointing in the same direction, without any of them having been arranged to do so. From this height, the only movement available is downward and outward away from the accumulation of specific evidence and toward the larger question of what all of it taken together might mean for how we understand the civilization we believe ourselves to be living inside. The landscape seen from a sufficient distance. Step back far enough from any body of evidence, and it stops looking like evidence. It starts looking like terrain, a landscape with its own topography, its own elevations and depressions, its own patterns of erosion that only become visible when you stop trying to read individual features and allow the whole to come into focus at once. The 9 chapters that precede this one have been moving through terrain of that kind, collecting specific artifacts, specific textual passages, specific isotope ratios and geodetic measurements and acoustic frequencies, building a case whose individual components each carry their own weight and whose cumulative pressure is by this point considerable. What this chapter does not do is add to that pressure. What it does is step back, far enough back that the individual components dissolve into the landscape they collectively form, and the landscape itself becomes the object of attention. The landscape seen from this distance has a single dominant feature. It is organized around concealment, not around creation, not around worship, not around the accumulation of power in the conventional sense, but around the specific and recurring act of hiding things underground, hiding the solar system behind spherical shells of debris, hiding the signal of a civilization beneath the noise of a larger and less coherent one, hiding the functional purpose of gold behind the language of sacred value. The concealment is not uniform. It operates at different scales simultaneously, planetary, architectural, biological, economic, and it is maintained across time spans that dwarf the duration of any known human civilization. But the principle organizing it is consistent enough and distributed enough across independent registers that it begins to function less like a coincidence and more like a design feature. Not proof of design. The texture of design, the quality that design things have when you encounter them without knowing what they are for. The gem. Elish, returned to now from this greater distance, reads differently than it did in the first chapter. It is no longer primarily a war narrative or a cosmological allegory or a political instrument, though it is all of those things. From sufficient distance it reads as a landscape map, a description of the terrain that the beings at its centre were navigating after a catastrophic event whose full nature the text can no longer directly name. The walls Marduk builds, the guards he posts the roof he raises over the deep. These are not the features of a triumphant cosmology. They are the features of a managed retreat, a civilization that survived something it did not entirely defeat, that took up a position of concealment in the aftermath, and that built its entire subsequent activity around maintaining that position without being detected. The theological overlay, the story of how Marduk became the king of the gods, how the world was made from Tiamat's body, how humanity was created to serve the divine order, is the surface of the map. The operational reality it is mapping is underneath. The atrahasis from this distance confirms the same terrain from a different vantage point. The gods who tremble, who panic, who authorize a planetary flood not from moral authority but from operational desperation, these are the same beings the Enuma Elish describes building walls after a war they did not entirely win. The flood in the atrahasis is not a punishment. It is a maintenance procedure, the surface of the planet being reset to reduce a signal that had become dangerous, the way a network administrator might clear a system that has begun broadcasting its location to entities it was not designed to contact. The humanity that survives the flood survives not as a beloved creation spared by a merciful God, but as a necessary component of the concealment architecture, a biological layer of noise and activity that, maintained at the right density and the right level of complexity, makes the planet below appear to be nothing more than what it looks like from the outside, a world of evolving animals, unremarkable, unworthy of closer attention. Gold from this distance resolves into its function with a clarity the close reading of economic history never quite achieves. It is not a store of value in the conventional sense. It is a maintenance material, the substance required to sustain the operating conditions of a concealment architecture operating at planetary scale, extracted by a labour force specifically designed for that purpose, refined and stored in quantities that serve a function the labour force itself was never told about. The compulsion to extract and hoard gold that runs through every human civilization from the Varna burials of 4500 BCE to the sealed vaults of modern central banks is the behavioural signature of a maintenance program running below the level of conscious understanding. A directive encoded deeply enough that it persists through every transformation of the civilization executing it, surviving the collapse of the monetary systems that nominally justify it, surviving the development of superior stores of value, surviving every rational argument against its continuation. The outer solar system structures the Kuiper belt's shepherded resonances. The Oort cloud's anomalous spherical geometry are from this distance the outermost layer of the same architecture. The defensive perimeter, the camouflage net, the watching station at the boundary. Whether these structures are natural or placed cannot be determined from the available evidence. What can be said is that they perform the function a defensive perimeter would need to perform, that their geometry corresponds with unusual precision to the defensive architecture described in the Enuma Elish, and that the standard natural formation explanations for both structures contain acknowledged gaps that have not been closed by subsequent research. The gaps may close, the correspondence may turn out to be coincidental. These are real possibilities. They are also after 9 chapters of accumulated pattern becoming slightly harder to hold with complete comfort. What the landscape reveals held at this distance is not a conspiracy in the conventional sense, not a group of beings making decisions in secret to control a population for their own benefit. It is something at once simpler and stranger, an architecture of survival built under conditions of extreme threat maintained across timescales that make human history look like an afternoon and so deeply embedded in the physical and behavioural record of this planet that the civilization living inside it has never in all its recorded existence managed to see it whole. We have been finding the pieces for centuries in the clay tablets of Nineveh, in the isotope ratios of the Martian atmosphere, in the geodetic relationships between pyramid complexes on opposite sides of the world, without recognizing that the pieces belong to the same object. And it is in the act of recognizing that in the specific quality of attention that settles when a hidden shape becomes visible, that this episode begins its final movement away from evidence and towards something the evidence was always pointing at, but could never quite become. What the question becomes when you stop trying to answer it. There is a particular moment in the study of any sufficiently old mystery when the investigation changes its nature without announcing the change. The researcher is still holding the same materials, the same tablets, the same isotope ratios, the same geodetic measurements, but something in the relationship between the researcher and the materials has quietly shifted. The materials are no longer being interrogated, they are being inhabited. The questions that seemed at the beginning to be pointing toward answers have revealed themselves to be pointing towards something else entirely, not a conclusion, but a condition, not a resolution, but a way of standing in relation to what cannot yet be known. Archaeology becomes philosophy at that moment. Not because the evidence runs out, it rarely does, but because the evidence begins to behave differently, begins to ask something of the person holding it rather than simply offering itself for analysis. What it asks in the case of everything assembled across the preceding chapters is a question that no amount of additional data will answer, because it is not that kind of question. It is the kind that has to be carried. The question stated plainly is this: if the Enuma Elish is encoding a memory of a real conflict, if the third faction was a real force, if the defensive architecture described in the text corresponds to real structures in the outer solar system, if the gods who trembled and flooded the surface and hard-coded the gold compulsion into a species they created for operational purposes were real beings managing a real concealment, then what are we? Not in the biological sense, not in the evolutionary sense, but in the sense that actually presses on the mind at 3 a.m, when the arguments have quieted and the pattern is sitting in the room with you visible and unresolved. What are we? If the civilization we believe ourselves to be inhabiting is a surface, a maintenance layer, a noise generator, a biological camouflage system laid over the something older, deeper, and operating by principles, we have not been given the conceptual vocabulary to understand. The philosophical tradition has circled this question without naming it directly for as long as philosophy has existed. Plato's allegory of the cave is in one reading, a description of a population that mistakes the surface for the whole, that takes the shadows on the wall for reality because the architecture of their situation prevents them from turning around. The Gnostic traditions of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE describe the material world as a construct not evil in itself, but incomplete, a partial reality administered by intermediate beings called archons, who were not the ultimate source of creation, but who managed the created order for their own purposes, keeping its inhabitants oriented away from the larger reality that surrounded and contained it. The Vedic concept of Maya, the veil of illusion that prevents direct perception of the underlying nature of existence, is not simply a metaphysical abstraction in its original context. It is a description of an operational condition. The world as it appears to perception is not the world as it is, and the gap between those two things is not a failure of human cognition, but a feature of the world's architecture. These traditions were not in contact with each other. They were not drawing on the same source texts. They arrived independently at the same structural description of the human situation, a population living on the surface of a deeper reality, separated from that reality by a layer they cannot see through, because the layer was designed to be opaque. We will not resolve this tonight. That is not what this space is for, and it is not what the evidence permits. What the evidence permits is something narrower and in its own way more valuable. It permits the question to be held at its full size, without the anxiety of needing to answer it without the reflex toward either credulous acceptance or defensive dismissal that the question tends to provoke in minds trained to require resolution before they will consent to rest. The question at its full size is not a conspiracy theory, it is not a religious claim, it is a genuine epistemic condition, a place where the available evidence assembled honestly and examined carefully produces a gap between what the standard model explains and what the pattern suggests, and that gap is large enough and consistent enough across enough independent registers that it deserves to be held rather than closed prematurely in either direction. Philosophy becomes cosmology when the question expands beyond the scale of human history and begins to touch the scale of the universe itself. The Fermi paradox. The observation that a universe as large and as old as this one should, by statistical expectation, contain many technological civilizations, and that we detect none of them, has a conventional set of explanations. Civilizations are rare, or they are brief, or the distances are too large, or the signals are too faint. But there is a less frequently discussed explanation that the assembled pattern of this episode makes newly legible civilizations may not be silent because they failed to develop, or because they destroyed themselves, or because the universe is emptier than the math suggests. They may be silent because silence is the survival strategy, because the universe contains predators large enough and capable enough that the only civilizations that persist across geological time are the ones that learned at some cost not to announce themselves. The silence of the universe in this reading is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of concealment practiced at civilizational scale by every surviving intelligence in the cosmos simultaneously for reasons they all learned the same way. That reading may be wrong. It is certainly not provable from the available evidence, but it has a coherence with the assembled pattern that the standard explanations for the Fermi paradox do not quite achieve, a coherence not of proof but of fitly the way a key fits a lock before you know whether it will turn. The Enuma Elish describes a universe in which the dominant operating condition is not peace, but managed concealment, not the orderly administration of a created world, but the precarious maintenance of a hidden position in a larger conflict whose resolution is not recorded in any text we have found. Whether that description is memory or myth that encodes memory in ways we have not yet learned to read, is a question the record leaves open with a patience that puts the urgency of any single human lifetime to shame. What remains after philosophy has done what it can and cosmology has opened, what it opens is something simpler and more immediate than either. It is the quality of a centre of tension that settles when a question this large is finally allowed to rest, not resolved, not dismissed, but set down carefully in the space between knowing and not knowing where it has always lived. The clay tablets in the British Museum are still there. The Xenon 129 is still in the Martian atmosphere. The Mercury is still pooled in its chamber beneath the pyramid of the feathered serpent. The asteroid belt is still between Mars and Jupiter, made of material that formed under pressures the standard model accounts for with a completeness that is almost but not entirely sufficient. These things do not change because the night deepens, or because the mind that holds them grows quiet. They simply wait the way old things wait for the attention that will eventually learn how to receive them. And it is in that waiting in the specific quality of stillness that descends when a question this old is finally given the silence it deserves, that the last image of this episode becomes visible. The tablet in the room where no one is looking. In the basement storage of the British Museum, in a climate-controlled drawer, among tens of thousands of catalogued objects that will never be displayed, there is a fragment of the Enuma Elish that measures approximately 9 centimeters by 6. It is not one of the celebrated tablets, not one of the 7 principal copies recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, not one of the pieces whose contents have been translated, debated, and reproduced in academic volumes for a century and a half. It is a fragment of a duplicate, a partial copy made by a scribe whose name was not recorded, preserved by the same accent of fire that preserved everything else, and catalogued with the careful neutrality that institutions apply to objects they do not yet know what to do with. The fragment contains in the portion of text that survived intact approximately 40 cuneiform signs. Scholars have identified the passage as belonging to the section of the 6th tablet that describes the period immediately after the conflict. the period of construction of fortification of the watching stations being set at the boundary. The signs are pressed cleanly into the clay. The scribe's hand was steady. Whatever the scribe understood about what they were copying, whether they read it as theology, as history, as administrative record, as something that had no name in their vocabulary, they pressed each wedge with the same care. The tablet did not know it would be the last copy made. The scribe did not know they were the last hand that would touch it before the library burned. The signs went into the clay anyway with the full attention the work required, and they have been waiting in the dark for 26 centuries for an attention that matches the one that made them. That image, the fragment in the drawer, the signs pressed in by an unnamed hand. The long wait in the dark is the one this episode ends with, because it contains in miniature everything the preceding 11 chapters have been trying to hold. The tablet is a physical object. It has weight and dimension. It can be measured and catalogued and stored in a controlled environment to prevent further degradation. It is also simultaneously the outermost layer of a question so large that the full extent of it has not yet been mapped, a question about what the people who made it knew what they were preserving, what they were afraid of losing, and whether the thing they were afraid of losing was lost anyway, or is still in some form the storage drawer cannot contain present in the record they left behind. The tablet is both things at once, and it does not resolve the tension between them. It simply holds it the way old objects hold everything I'd asked of them, without preference for one reading over another. The night deepens here the way it does when thinking has gone as far as thinking can go, and what remains is something that thinking is not the right instrument for. The asteroid belt is out there in the dark between Mars and Jupiter, its micro-diamonds formed under pressures that the standard model accounts for adequately the debris distributed across the orbital zone, that the Enuma Elish called the hammered bracelet, two readings of the same region of space sitting side by side without resolution. The Martian surface is out there too, red and cold and thin atmosphered at xenon 129 distributed in patterns that John Brandenburg argued were inconsistent with natural processes, and that the mainstream scientific community argued were not both arguments still in the record, neither one having eliminated the other. The Oort cloud is at the edge of everything too distant to directly observe, inferred from the trajectories of comets that arrive from all directions, like messages from a boundary no instrument has yet crossed and returned from. These things do not require the mind's active attention to continue being what they are. They persist without it. They were persisting before the first human being pressed the first reed into the first wet clay and left the first mark that said something happened, and I am trying to record it before it is gone. The gold is in its vaults, 12 kilograms per standard bar stacked in rooms beneath cities that were built above older cities, the extraction chain running backward through 5,000 years of recorded human activity and further back than that into the pre-literate stratum where the Varna burials are waiting in the Bulgarian earth. The oldest worked gold in the world placed in graves by people whose reasons went with them. The compulsion is still running. The maintenance program is still executing below the level of any conscious decision to continue it in the behavior of institutions that do not know why they will not stop. The program does not need to be understood to continue. It only needs the next person in the chain to do what the previous person did, and the person before that, all the way back to whoever wrote the first instruction and trusted that the chain would hold. These are the last objects of the night. Not conclusions, not evidence for a claim that has been proven or disproven in the hours this episode has occupied. They are the furnishings of a question that has been allowed for a little while to exist at its full size. The question of what happened before recorded history, what the Enuma Elish is the outermost surface of what the unnamed scribe was copying, when the ships they pressed those 40 signs into the clay with a steady hand in a library that was going to burn. The question does not need to be answered tonight. It has been waiting longer than tonight, longer than this civilization longer, perhaps than the gap between the planet you are lying on and the belt of debris that may or may not be a graveyard between Mars and Jupiter. It will wait a little longer while you sleep. The fragment is still in the drawer, the signs are still legible. The scribe's attention is still in the clay pressed there by a hand that understood even without the vocabulary to articulate the understanding that some things are worth recording, carefully, worth the full weight of attention, worth the steadiness of hand, even when you do not know what you are recording, or who will eventually read it, or whether the reading will come before the burning. You press the signs in anyway, you make the record, you trust the clay to hold what the night cannot. We will not resolve this tonight. What we can do, what this space has always been for, is hold the question in the dark without flinching and then set it down and let the mind that has been carrying it finally go quiet. The fragment is in its drawer, the signs are legible, the question is intact, nothing more is required of you now. Rest now, traveller. Austin. Henry Layard lifted the first tablet from the rubble of Nineveh on a morning in 1849, and the record says he stood for a moment before setting it down, not because it was fragile, though it was, but because something in the weight of it stopped him. 9 centimetres of fired clay, 40-odd cuneiform signs pressed in by a hand that had been dust for 2,000 years. The morning light of northern Iraq falling across wedge marks that described in language no living person had yet learned to read the moment after a war that may or may not have happened. The construction of walls that may or may not have been built. The posting of guards at a boundary that may or may not be the edge of the solar system or the edge of something else entirely. He set it down. He picked up the next one. He kept working. That is what you do when the question is larger than the morning. The question is still larger than the morning. It was larger than all the evenings this episode moved through the asteroid belt and its microdiamonds, the trembling gods of the Atrahasis, the Mercury sealed in its chamber beneath the pyramid of the feathered serpent. The fragment in the British Museum drawer pressing its 40 signs into the dark. None of those things resolved tonight. None of them were going to. The pattern they form is the kind that takes years to hold properly, the kind that shifts slightly every time you return to it, showing a different edge, depending on the angle of approach and the quality of attention you bring. That is not a failure of the pattern. That is the nature of questions this old. They do not yield to a single sitting. They ask to be carried for a while, set down, picked up again, carried a little further. The carrying is the work. The resolution, if it ever comes later in some future morning, that neither this episode nor this night can see. There is a particular comfort in that, if you are willing to let it be a comfort rather than a frustration. History is not a solved problem waiting to be disclosed. It is a landscape being mapped by people who can only stand in one place at a time, who can only see as far as the light reaches, who are working with instruments that were designed for a different kind of knowing than the kind of these questions require. The Sumerian scribes who copied the Atrahasis did not know they were preserving something that 21st century researchers would hold up to the isotope ratios of the Martian atmosphere, and find unsettlingly that the edges aligned. They were doing their work in their morning with the instruments available to them. You are doing yours. The alignment, if it is an alignment, will be there tomorrow as well. The outer solar system is still out there in the dark, the Kuiper belt running. Its slow resonances, the Oort cloud at the edge of everything, too distant to directly observe, the inferred gravity of something large and unconfirmed, pulling a subset of trans-Neptunian objects into clustered orbits that the data does not yet fully explain. That will also be there tomorrow. The universe is not in a hurry. It has been holding these particular arrangements of matter and motion for longer than the concept of waiting has existed, and it will continue to hold them through whatever remains of the night and well into whatever follows it. You are not required to resolve them before sleep. You are never required to resolve them at all. One question carried lightly into the dark in a universe where silence may be the oldest survival strategy available to any intelligence that has lived long enough to learn it. What does it mean that you are still listening? Let that question drift where questions go when the mind goes quiet. You do not need to answer it. It does not need answering tonight. The clay is in its drawer. The signs are legible. The scribe's hand is still there in the material pressed in with the full attention the work required, trusting the record to outlast the burning. Outside the night holds the same stars the Babylonian astronomers mapped with patient naked eye observation. Across centuries of cloudless desert dark, the same stars, the Enuma Elish placed its watching stations among the same stars, the pyramid shafts were oriented toward the same stars that have been neither closer nor further away through all of it. They are asking nothing of you right now. They are simply present the way old things are present, without urgency, without demand, without any need for the attention you are about to release into sleep. Let the body grow heavy, let the question settle, the way silt settles in still water, not gone, not resolved, simply resting at a depth where they will wait for you. The tablet waited 26 centuries. Your questions can wait until morning. Sleep well, traveller. The record will be here when you return to it,